The 1.5-inch HKR, the subject of our final repair program in the Koomey regulator series. These regulators are located in the pods, and they regulate pressure to many stack functions. We'll show you the critical aspects of the repair procedures. Depend on your rig manual and valve drawing for the detailed procedures and part numbers. In particular, note the numbers for the seal and repair kits. Some general reminders. As always, once you've located the faulty valve, make sure system pressure is vented and all gauges read 0 before you pull the valve from the system. Even then, loosen hose fittings slowly. A little pressure may still be in the lines. Your work area must be clean. Make sure it's clear of dust and dirt. Have plenty of clean rags on hand. First step, as you've seen in other shows, mark the flanges so you'll reassemble the valve exactly as you took it apart. Each valve is manufactured with stamped-in marks, like here. Unfortunately, the valves you work with are subsea. Most likely the marks are corroded away by seawater. You'll have to make your own. This valve appears to be clean, but later you'll see by the condition of the inside that it's seen a lot of hard work. In fact, this valve saw action as part of a test facility. As we disassemble the valve, we'll touch on the highlights of the disassembly process. The details are up to you. Read your subsea manuals and refer to the valve drawing often. As you take the valve apart, handle the pieces gently. Don't force anything. Don't yank on any of the internal parts or flanges. Above all, use your common sense. You've got several flanges to remove, and it really doesn't matter what order they come off. Tap them lightly with a hammer if you have to, and rotate the flanges back and forth until they slide out. With the side flanges removed, you can see the seal container inside. This is the vent cage and seals, here. The inlet seal cage and rings are above. As it is now, the valve is upside down in the vise. The head flange is to the bottom. We're going to turn the valve back over and tap the seal container out the bottom. Because of the seals on the plunger, you might have to use a brass rod to tap the whole thing out. Be careful as the seal container is about to come out. Don't knock it all the way with a hammer. The last hit will knock it onto the floor. As it starts to loosen up, tap it the rest of the way by hand. If you ever have trouble removing a valve part, use a brass or wooden rod and nothing else to do the job. Be sure to clean away any brass or wood chips before you reassemble the valve. The plunger guide comes out through the top. You should be able to get it by hand. If not, use a brass rod from the bottom. When you push out the seal and vent rings, don't use any hard objects, not even a brass rod. The sealing edges are made to specific tolerances that could be damaged by metal tools. Use your fingers to do that job. Make sure they're coated with a light lubricant. This will keep corrosive skin acids away from finely polished metal surfaces. Just in case you reuse the seal or vent rings, keep them in some kind of order so you'll replace them exactly as you took them out. Each of these valves builds its own wear pattern. If you change the position of the seals, you'll change that pattern, and the valve may never work right again unless you replace everything. After the valve is broken down into its components, pull the old seals. Now is a good time to have the new seal kit on hand. Compare the old seals to the new ones. Replacements must be identical. Don't guess which ring goes where. Make sure. As you pull the old seals, be careful not to damage any ring grooves. When you pull the rubber around the seal and vent rings, be sure not to damage the sealing edges. Be sure to separate the flow plates from the flanges. There are O-rings between the flow plates and flanges. And one other area you might miss. Be sure to separate the plunger from the seal container. There's a small O-ring on the stem of the plunger. When you clean the valve parts, be as thorough as possible. Clean every seal surface, ring groove, flange face, bore, etc. Use a solvent or diesel, Even soap and water will do. The internal parts should be fairly clean to begin with. If you find this kind of dirt, check the BOP fluid in the reservoir. On the non-seal areas, it's okay to use emery cloth or steel wool to remove this debris. But make sure the emery cloth or steel wool is soaked in solvent and use either gently. And never use emery cloth or steel wool on the plate faces or seal rings. If they're so dirty that you need steel wool to clean them, then replace them. Steel wool or emery cloth will easily ruin the sealing surfaces. One last part. Clean the cap screws. Look for damaged threads. Replace whatever screws you can't repair. Inspection and reassembly. Let's point out some critical areas. If you've seen the other 3 shows, you know the kinds of things we're looking for. The ring grooves. Check each O-ring groove for nicks or burrs that could cut the new seals. Everything comes in the repair kit except the flanges. If you have to replace one of them because of a damaged groove, you'll have to order it separately. In particular, let's look at the seal and vent rings. Inspect the sealing edges of the rings. They seal around the ports and against the plates. If they're damaged at all, the valve won't hold a seal. And if you have to replace the seals, replace the flow and seal plates too. If the rings are damaged, chances are the plates are too, even if you can't detect it. And remember that wear pattern we've talked about? If you change a seal ring, you change the pattern. So put in a new repair kit. The seal container. The outside doesn't have any seal surfaces. Just see that it's smooth. But if you find any nicks or burrs, check the inside of the valve body. There may be some damage that coincides with the damage on the seal container. Then check the ring bores. They should all be clean and smooth. Any nicks, burrs, or irregular wear patterns may damage the O-rings around the seal rings. If they're scoring, the O-rings won't seal in the bore at all. Fluid will just slip past. Replace the seal container if the bores are damaged. Inspect the bore and the plunger guide. If there's any scoring on the plunger or torn seals, there may be damage inside the bore. It should be clean and smooth. And like the seal ring bores, scoring in the plunger guide bore will prevent the plunger seals from doing their job. The plates. Check the wear marks. Even though they're visible, they must be smooth. If not, replace them and put in the entire repair kit. On the mating surfaces of the flow ports, make sure the edges around the port are smooth. The O-rings seat here. Look at this bottom flange. Much the same damage we saw in the 1-inch HKR in the last program. Not quite as bad though. As long as the ring groove is still intact, this flange is fine. When you're satisfied that the inspection process is complete, put all your new seals in place. Several general reminders here. You've heard them before. Lubricate each seal with a light lubricant before you install it. Don't use a petroleum-based lubricant on natural rubber seals. And silicone lubricants may have an adverse effect on valve parts in saltwater applications. Most importantly, don't over-lubricate. Don't use grease unless you have to. Lubrication eases the assembly of the valve, nothing more. If you over-lubricate or use grease on the rubber parts, you're inviting trouble, especially on working seals. The lubricant, grease in particular, will collect particles in your BOP fluid and rub it around like sandpaper. We recommend hydraulic oil, vegetable oil, or your hydraulic concentrate. Be cautious as you install Teflon rings. Don't expand them too far to get them on. They won't return to their original shape. Be patient. You'll find installing rubber O-rings and Teflon backup rings to be a difficult, often impossible task. In this valve, you don't have too many small rings, so it shouldn't be that tough. Just be sure not to cut any seals or grooves. These seal rings may look familiar. They're the same ones you've seen in the 1-inch valves, and the outside seals go on the same way. O-ring toward the spring side and Teflon backup ring toward the sealing edge. The purpose is exactly the same: to keep high-pressure fluid in the center from pinching the O-ring between the seal ring and the bore. When you've installed all the seals, it's time to put the whole thing back together. The reassembly procedure is basically a reverse of the disassembly procedure. Let's detail the critical points for you. The seal rings. If by chance you're using the old rings and plates, put them back into the bores in exactly the same positions. It doesn't matter which side you place them in from, but place them in one piece at a time. Notice the sealing edges and backup rings are toward the outside. And again, don't use any hard objects, not even a brass or wooden rod. Same caution with the vent rings. Place by hand only, but you'll assemble the vent cage and rings before you put them back into the seal container. When you place the plunger guide over the plunger, be sure the seals don't get cut on the edge of the guide. Then slide the seal container and plunger guide into the valve body from the top. Be sure the cutout area faces the outlet opening. You might be able to seat the plunger guide by hand. If not, put the bottom flange on and use a brass hammer around the top.
Very good.
Now you can start replacing flanges. Coat only enough cap screws with anti-seize for one flange at a time. There are about 50 of these things. Don't do every one of them all at once. They'll sit around and collect dust until you get to them. Rotate the flanges on in the same manner you took them off. Look for your reference marks. Match them exactly. And with this valve, let's leave you with one word: heavy. When you pull it from the stack or take it out of the vise, be aware that it weighs 72 pounds. Well, this is the final Koomey regulator repair program. There's one more tape in this series on the subject of Koomey regulators. It follows this one. It's called Troubleshooting the Koomey Regulators. This program is intended as a supplement to the subsea manual and your own experience. Take some